The courthouse stood tall against the gray morning sky, its stone pillars casting long shadows over the steps. Inside, the air was heavy, weighed down by weeks of testimony, arguments, and unrelenting tension. The trial had dragged on far longer than anyone expected, and despite all the effort of lawyers and investigators, the outcome remained uncertain. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Some came out of duty, others from curiosity, and a few simply because they couldn't resist the gravity of a case whispered about in every newspaper headline. Yet that morning, the crowd was quieter than usual. Something unusual was about to unfold, something that would set this trial apart from all others. For days, the jury had sat through evidence that felt incomplete. The prosecution had presented their case with vigor, but the defense fought back with equal sharpness, poking holes in testimony, dismissing details, and reminding everyone that the standard was not suspicion, but proof beyond reasonable doubt. And proof, it seemed, was slipping through the prosecution's fingers. Then, almost reluctantly, the court allowed one final witness to appear. A child. The bailiff opened the side door gently, as though not to disturb the delicate balance of the room, and a hush swept across the courtroom. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, their eyes narrowing in curiosity. A small figure appeared in the doorway, no taller than the height of the benches. She was 3 years old, dressed in a pale dress with shoes that clicked lightly on the polished floor. In one hand, she held a worn stuffed rabbit, its ear bent and seams frayed from too much love. Her other hand was clasped in the grip of a court-appointed child advocate, who guided her toward the witness stand, as though leading her through a maze. The child looked around, her wide eyes darting between the towering ceiling, the robed judge, a row of unfamiliar faces staring at her, and finally, the stranger in the defendant's chair. Her steps faltered when she noticed him. For a brief second, her face clouded with confusion, then fear. The advocate gave her hand a squeeze and whispered something soft. The little girl continued forward, though her head dipped lower, the rabbit pressed tightly to her chest. The room, usually buzzing with whispers or the quiet shuffle of papers, was now utterly still. Even the ticking of the courtroom clock seemed too loud. Everyone was waiting to see what could possibly be expected from a toddler, how someone barely able to string sentences together could contribute to a case where adult testimonies had already faltered. Beside the witness stand, a large German shepherd shifted quietly. His fur gleamed under the courtroom lights, and his calm, steady posture contrasted sharply with the nervous child. This was the police dog assigned to the child witness program, a relatively new initiative meant to support young or vulnerable witnesses. Trained not for aggression, but for comfort. The dog had been present in trials before, but never had his role carried stakes this high. The girl's eyes found the animal, and for the first time since she entered the courtroom, her body relaxed ever so slightly. She let go of the advocate's hand and crouched down, resting a small palm on the dog's head. The shepherd remained still, only blinking slowly, as though understanding that this moment was more important than any command he had ever been trained to follow. The judge leaned forward. His stern expression softened, his voice unusually gentle as he addressed the child. "Do you know why you're here today?" The girl didn't answer. She pressed her face into the dog's fur, inhaling deeply, as if drawing courage from the scent of something safe and familiar. The prosecutor, seated at her desk, exchanged a glance with her colleague. She knew this was fragile ground. Too much pressure, and the child would retreat into silence. Too little, and the moment might slip away unused. From the jury box, some members smiled faintly, their guarded skepticism softening. Parents among them recognized that look of fear, the clutch of a toy, the reliance on something familiar. It wasn't evidence yet, but it was human, and it stirred something in them that all the previous charts and documents had not. The defense lawyer, however, leaned back in his chair, smirking slightly. In his mind, this was a desperate move and emotional play by the prosecution, not a legal one. He whispered something to his client, who nodded with thin confidence. But the atmosphere in the courtroom was shifting. The advocate crouched beside the child, speaking softly in her ear. The little girl nodded, though she didn't look up. Her small fingers tangled in the police dog's fur, and for the first time, her lips parted as if to speak. The sound was faint, barely audible over the hum of the heating vents. The court reporter lifted her head, straining to catch it. The judge held up a hand, silencing even the smallest movements. The child said nothing more, but that whisper, fragile, hesitant, was enough to ripple through the courtroom. People sat forward, unsure if they had imagined it. The prosecutor's eyes sharpened with sudden hope, while the defense stiffened, their earlier confidence evaporating. The dog remained perfectly still, unbothered by the attention, his calm presence anchoring the child in a storm of fear. The moment lasted only seconds, but to those present, it felt eternal. Something had been spoken, something no one expected from a toddler too young to understand the weight of testimony. The advocate whispered encouragement again, but the girl didn't repeat herself. She simply sat down, curling into the police dog's side, the stuffed rabbit wedged between them. Gasps and whispers began to stir in the gallery until the judge's gavel cracked sharply against the wood. Order! His voice was firm, but beneath it, even he seemed unsettled by what had just occurred. No one said it aloud yet, but everyone in the room understood. The smallest witness had entered the courtroom, and with barely 2 words, she had shifted its balance. The defense might dismiss it. The prosecutor might seize it. The jury might debate it. But the truth was undeniable. Something important had just been revealed, and it had not come from experts, lawyers, or investigators. It had come from a child no older than 3, clutching a stuffed rabbit, whispering into the ear of a dog. For the first time since the trial began, the room was alive with a new kind of tension, one born not from legal arguments, but from innocence. And as the jurors glanced at each other, silent questions hung in the air. What did the child mean? What did those words reveal? And would justice finally find its voice through the smallest witness of them all? The courtroom waited, hushed and unsettled, as though holding its breath. The story was only beginning. The courtroom had regained its rhythm after the child's appearance, though the whisper of her small voice lingered in the air like smoke. Jurors exchanged silent glances, and even the most stoic among them seemed unsettled. But while part 1 of the morning had belonged to the innocence of a child, the next hours belonged to the machinery of justice. The case itself laid bare in all its complexity. The defendant sat at the end of the defense table, his shoulders squared, his jaw clenched tight. He had been there every day, wearing the same blank expression that masked both his fear and his arrogance. To some, he looked like a man wrongly accused, tired, perhaps, but dignified. To others, there was something too carefully composed about him, a face trained to show nothing, hiding everything. His attorney was sharper in demeanor, a man seasoned by years of high-profile cases. He thrived on dismantling narratives, breaking apart testimonies piece by piece until nothing was left but uncertainty. And uncertainty was his weapon. It was all he needed. Across the aisle, the prosecution sat with furrowed brows and restless hands. They had prepared for this trial for months, combing through every scrap of evidence, every report, every witness. They knew what they believed, but belief was not enough. The burden of proof was heavy, and the defense knew how to make it feel impossible to carry. The crime itself was chilling, though the details had been deliberately muted in the courtroom to protect the young witness. Behind the sterile words of misconduct and assault lay a darker reality. One, the prosecution struggled to bring into sharp focus without overwhelming the jury. The evidence was fragile, the timeline messy, the testimonies fractured. Early in the trial, the prosecution had leaned heavily on forensic evidence, fingerprints, photographs, medical examinations. But the defense had been ruthless, casting doubt on every scrap. A fingerprint could be explained away by contact unrelated to the crime. Medical reports, they argued, were open to interpretation. And photographs? They only captured fragments, not full stories. Witnesses had come and gone, some trembling, others defiant. But memory, the defense reminded the jury again and again, was unreliable. People misremember. People exaggerate. People fill in the blanks with what they think they saw. It was true, the jury had shifted uneasily more than once as witnesses, contradicted themselves or faltered under cross-examination. The prosecution's case, though strong in passion, was vulnerable in presentation. The defense had built its strategy on that weakness, not proving innocence, but manufacturing doubt. And until now, it seemed to be working. The little girl's appearance had disrupted that rhythm, like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. But ripples were not yet waves, and the defense attorney reminded himself of that as he rose to address the court again. He straightened his suit jacket, stepped into the open space between tables, and turned toward the jury with a practiced smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not lose ourselves in sympathy or sentiment," he began smoothly. "We are here for facts. Facts, not feelings, determine guilt." His voice was calm, deliberate. He gestured toward the child, now seated with her advocate in the gallery, clutching both rabbit and police dog as if clinging to a lifeline. "We all feel protective of innocence. It is human. But feelings are not evidence. Words spoken by a child, barely able to form sentences, cannot be the basis for condemning a man's life." Some jurors nodded unconsciously, though others stiffened at his cold dismissal. The prosecutor rose to object, but the judge held up a hand. "You'll have your chance," he said. The defense attorney pressed on. He knew his strength was in control, keeping the jury grounded in logic, tethered away from emotion. "This case is filled with assumptions," he declared. "We are asked to believe timelines that don't add up, testimonies that change with every retelling, and evidence that is far from conclusive. Reasonable doubt is not a small thing. It is the foundation of justice." He paused, letting the weight of the phrase sink in. Reasonable doubt. A golden shield. On the other side, the lead prosecutor stood slowly. She adjusted her notes, though she barely looked at them. Her eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had carried the weight of victims too young to defend themselves. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but charged with conviction. "This case," she said, "is not built on assumptions. It is built on courage, on the willingness of those harmed to step forward, even when terrified. We ask this jury not to replace reason with sympathy, but to understand that truth sometimes comes from the smallest voices, the quietest moments." Her gaze swept over the jurors, and then landed, ever so briefly, on the child in the gallery. That little girl saw more than any child should ever see. She carries memories no child should carry. Do not dismiss her because her words are few. Sometimes the truth needs only 2 words. The gallery shifted, murmurs rising until the judge's gavel cut through the noise. Order returned, but the impact lingered. The prosecutor continued, detailing the evidence once more not as fragments, but as threads in a larger tapestry. She painted a picture of timelines aligning when seen through the right lens. She pointed to corroboration between witnesses, even if imperfect, and to the way the accused's behavior matched patterns investigators had seen time and again. It was not flawless. The defense would pounce on cracks in the wall. But the prosecutor knew she didn't need perfection. She needed humanity. She needed the jury to believe that absence of certainty was not the same as absence of truth. Through it all, the child sat quietly, her tiny hand resting on the police dog's fur. She didn't understand the legal arguments or the battle of rhetoric unfolding before her. But every now and then, she glanced at the man in the defendant's chair, and her face clouded with the same fear she'd shown when she first walked into the room. And the jury noticed. One juror, a mother of two, found herself gripping her pen harder than usual, her jaw tightening at the sight. Another, a man who had once volunteered at a child advocacy center, tapped his foot against the floor, restless. These were not facts, but they were impressions, and impressions, whether judges liked it or not, shaped verdicts. The defense attorney sat down, confident in his dismantling. The prosecutor remained standing, her voice ringing with quiet resolve as she closed her argument for the day. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Do not mistake youth for unreliability. Sometimes truth does not come in volumes, it comes in whispers. And whispers, ladies and gentlemen, can be louder than lies. The judge dismissed the jury for recess, but as they filed out, the tension in their faces told its own story. The case was no longer a battle of logic alone. It had become something deeper, a war between fact and impression, doubt and instinct, evidence and innocence. And though the trial was far from over, the balance had shifted. The courtroom had become a theater where every glance, every pause, every whisper carried weight. And in that theater, the smallest actor, the child, had already stolen the stage. The courtroom was tense when the child was called forward again. The jury had returned from recess, and though their faces were neutral, their body language betrayed unease. They had seen hardened witnesses crack under pressure, experts contradict themselves, and lawyers twist words into knots. But nothing unsettled them more than the presence of a toddler on the witness stand. The bailiff opened the side door once more, and the little girl emerged slowly. Her steps were hesitant, as though she was walking into a place where she didn't belong. In one hand, she clutched her rabbit, the toy now worn to the point where its seams gaped. In the other, she reached instinctively for the child advocate who guided her forward. The hush in the courtroom was immediate, more profound than during any prior testimony. The girl's eyes scanned the room. She saw the tall ceiling, the heavy wood benches, the strange faces watching her intently. Then her gaze fell upon the man in the defendant's chair. It lasted only a moment, but that glance sent a visible shiver through her body. She quickly looked away, pressing her face into the soft fur of her stuffed rabbit. The advocate crouched low, whispering something gentle, and gestured toward the police dog that had already been led to the stand. The German shepherd sat patiently, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. His ears twitched, but he didn't move until the little girl knelt beside him. She reached out, laying her hand on his head, and for the first time since stepping into the room, her shoulders relaxed slightly. It was a simple gesture, but it didn't go unnoticed. The jury, scattered across two rows, leaned forward. They had seen adults fumble under cross-examination, voices raised in defiance or breaking under tears. But this was different. This was raw innocence. The sight of a child finding courage through a dog spoke louder than any expert testimony had. The judge, who had presided over countless cases in his career, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His gavel had silenced shouting matches between attorneys, yet here he found himself lowering his voice, as though afraid to scare the child. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "can you sit in the chair for us? You don't have to be afraid." The child didn't answer. She looked at the chair, then back at the dog, and shook her head firmly. The prosecutor intervened, her tone soft but steady. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, the witness may remain seated with the dog. She communicates best this way." The defense immediately rose. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irregular." "We can't allow," but before he could finish, the girl turned her face toward the sound of his voice, her wide eyes brimming with fear. She clutched the dog's neck tighter, burying her cheek into his fur. The jury saw it, the pure, instinctive terror, and the defense attorney stopped short, realizing he might have overplayed his hand. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. Objection overruled. The witness may remain with the dog. The prosecutor knelt beside the girl, her presence unthreatening. She didn't ask complex questions. She didn't press for details. Instead, she began with simple things: her name, her favorite toy, what she liked to eat. The child answered in short, halting words, her small voice barely audible in the cavernous room. Yet with each answer, her confidence grew. The jury watched, fascinated. It was as though they were witnessing a delicate flower opening in real time, slowly but unmistakably. Then came the shift. The prosecutor asked gently, "Do you remember why you're here today?" The girl hesitated, tightening her grip on the dog's fur. Her lips trembled. For a long moment, silence stretched across the courtroom, so profound that the scratching of the court reporter's pen seemed thunderous. Finally, the child whispered something inaudible. The prosecutor leaned closer. "Can you say it a little louder?" The little girl turned, not to the prosecutor, not to the judge, but to the dog. She lowered her face to his ear and spoke again, soft and trembling. The room froze. Jurors leaned forward, straining to catch the words. The court reporter tilted her head, her fingers hovering above the keys. Even the defendant sat up straighter, his mask of calm cracking for the first time. 2 words. Just 2. They were childlike, simple, yet they carried a weight far beyond their syllables. The dog didn't move, but the girl pressed closer against him, as if giving her secret to him alone. The prosecutor's eyes widened. She repeated the words for the record, her voice steady, though her pulse raced. She said, "Bad man." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The jurors exchanged looks, some horrified, some grim, some with eyes narrowing in recognition of the truth that had just broken through the silence. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. Objection. Inadmissible. A child this young doesn't know what she's saying this is. The judge slammed his gavel. Order. His tone was sharp, but his eyes betrayed unease. He knew the weight those 2 words carried, even if he was bound to remind the jury about the limitations of child testimony. But the jury had heard it. They had seen the child's trembling body, her eyes darting toward the defendant, her instinctive clinging to the dog for protection. Facts and evidence mattered, yes, but impressions mattered too. And this impression was indelible. The prosecutor didn't push further. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked one last question, her tone gentle as a whisper. "Do you feel safe here?" The girl shook her head. Her hand gripped the dog tighter, and she leaned into him, as if he alone could shield her from the shadow across the room. The gallery stirred again, whispers crackling like electricity. The judge's gavel brought silence, but the energy didn't dissipate. Everyone in that room knew something had shifted. The child's demeanor, her fear, her trust in the dog, her whispered words had cut through the polished arguments of lawyers and the sterile weight of evidence. For the jury, it wasn't just testimony. It was a window into truth untainted by calculation. When the child was finally let out, still clutching her rabbit and the dog's fur, the jury's eyes followed her. Some softened, others hardened, but none were unchanged. And as the heavy doors closed behind her, the defendant shifted in his seat. For the first time since the trial began, a bead of sweat slid down his temple. He knew it. The jury knew it. The prosecution knew it. 2 words had opened the door, and the child's demeanor had thrown it wide enough that no one could ignore what stood on the other side. The courtroom had never felt so fragile. The walls of oak and stone seemed to press inward, as though holding the weight of centuries of justice, now balanced precariously on the lips of a 3-year-old child. For weeks, the trial had been driven by facts, exhibits, testimonies, and procedure. But all of that had shifted when the girl leaned into the German shepherd's fur and whispered 2 words that echoed louder than any sworn statement. "Bad man?" They were not screamed. They were not repeated in rehearsed tones. They were whispered with the timid honesty of a child who knew no artifice, no strategy, no courtroom game. And that was what made them devastating. At first, many wondered if they had even heard correctly. The words were so soft, almost drowned in the stillness. But the prosecutor repeated them aloud for the record, her voice trembling but clear, and in that moment, the reality sank in. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A woman in the back clasped her hand over her mouth. A man on the jury exhaled sharply, shaking his head in disbelief. The court reporter's fingers hovered in the air before hammering down the keys, immortalizing those words in the transcript of history. The defendant's face, once calm and guarded, twisted into a mask of rage that he tried to hide beneath feigned composure. But it was too late. The jury had seen it, the flicker of anger, the tightening jaw, the sudden shift in his posture. If innocence had been his mask, it was cracking. His attorney shot to his feet, his voice sharp, desperate. "Objection, Your Honor. This is wholly inadmissible. A 3-year-old cannot be considered a competent witness. This court cannot allow a man's future to hang on the babbling of a child." The judge raised his gavel, but hesitated. His expression was troubled, his years on the bench fighting against his instincts as a father and grandfather. Finally, he struck the gavel once, not with force, but with weary caution. "Objection noted. The jury is instructed to weigh the credibility of all testimony appropriately. Proceed." But everyone knew the words were already etched into the minds of the jury. No instruction could erase them. The prosecutor didn't rush. She didn't press the child for more. She understood that pressing could destroy the fragile truth they had just witnessed. Instead, she simply asked, "Can you tell us who the bad man is?" The courtroom held its breath. The little girl turned her head, just slightly, toward the defense table. Her tiny finger, trembling, lifted from the dog's fur and pointed directly at the defendant. The air seemed to shatter. A chorus of murmurs broke out, muffled gasps filling the room. The judge pounded the gavel, his voice booming. "Order! Order in the court!" But order was impossible. The jury's eyes were wide, their pens stilled mid-note. Some had tears brimming. Others leaned back, stunned, their skepticism evaporating. The gallery buzzed with disbelief, mothers clutching their handbags tightly, fathers staring with clenched jaws. The defense attorney rushed forward, his hands raised. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This child has been coached, clearly coached." He turned sharply toward the jury, desperation in his voice. "You must understand, children at this age are highly suggestible. They repeat what they are told. This is not truth. This is manipulation." The prosecutor rose calmly, her voice cutting like glass. "Or perhaps, counselor, this is the purest truth we have heard in this courtroom. A child may not understand procedure, but she knows right from wrong. And she just told you who the wrong is." The jury stirred again, their focus snapping between the attorneys, the judge, and most of all, the small girl seated beside the police dog. The dog hadn't moved once. His calmness seemed otherworldly, as though he were the anchor in a storm of human chaos. The child clung to him, unshaken by the uproar she had caused, unaware of the firestorm ignited by her small gesture. The judge rubbed his temples, weary. He had presided over cases filled with scientific evidence, expert witnesses, mountains of paperwork. Yet never had he seen 12 citizens so profoundly moved by 2 words and a pointed finger. The defense pressed harder. "Your Honor, I demand that this testimony be stricken from the record. The child's statement is prejudicial, unreliable, and cannot stand." The judge sighed, his gavel poised, but unmoving. "Counselor, I cannot strike what the jury has seen and heard with their own eyes and ears. You may challenge its credibility in cross-examination." "Then I will," the defense snapped, his face flushed with fury. He turned toward the child, towering over her in a way that made half the jury shift uncomfortably. The child shrank back instantly, her grip on the dog tightening. "Young lady," the defense began, his tone falsely sweet, "you don't really know what you just said, do you? Someone told you to say that. Isn't that right? Someone told you he was a bad man." The girl didn't answer. She pressed closer into the dog's fur, burying her face as tears welled in her eyes. The prosecutor shot up. "Objection. Harassment of a minor witness." The judge's gavel came down hard this time. "Sustained. Counselor, step back immediately." The defense retreated reluctantly, realizing the damage his aggression had caused. If the jury had wavered before, they weren't wavering now. They had seen fear in its purest form, a child recoiling instinctively from the very man she had called bad. The prosecutor stepped forward again, her voice softer than before, almost maternal. "Sweetheart, you did so well. You don't have to say anything else. Thank you for being so brave." The child sniffled, nodding faintly, and clung tighter to the dog. The German shepherd shifted just enough to nuzzle against her arm, and for the first time, she allowed herself the tiniest of smiles. The jury melted at the sight. Hardened men, mothers of teenagers, retirees with decades of cynicism, all of them saw the same truth. A child had found courage not in the adults around her, but in the silent loyalty of a dog. The judge finally dismissed her, allowing the advocate to guide her out. The heavy doors closed, but the echo of her words remained in the courtroom like a haunting refrain. "Bad Nan." 2 words. That was all it took to unravel weeks of careful defense, to pierce through layers of legal maneuvering, to shift the entire tide of a trial. The defense attorney slumped into his chair, sweat gathering at his brow. He knew the battle was not lost yet. The law demanded more than emotion. But he also knew the truth. He could no longer control the narrative. The jury had heard the child. They had seen her fear. They had witnessed her instinctive reaction to his client. And that could not be undone. The prosecutor sat down slowly, her heart still racing, but her eyes alive with fire. For the first time in weeks, she felt the scales tipping, not just in her favor, but in favor of justice itself. The defendant sat rigid, his face pale, his fists clenched beneath the table. Rage simmered in his eyes, but there was fear too, the fear of a man who had always believed he could hide in plain sight, now exposed by the smallest witness imaginable. The courtroom, though still buzzing from the storm, knew they had just witnessed a turning point. Trials were built on evidence, but sometimes evidence came not in pages or charts, but in the trembling whisper of a child too young to lie. And as the jury scribbled their notes, exchanging glances heavy with silent agreement, one thing became clear: this case would never again be the same. The courtroom had quieted, but silence was deceptive. Beneath the stillness, a storm brewed in every mind seated in the jury box, every heart in the gallery, and every corner of the prosecution's table. 2 words, spoken by a child too small to tie her own shoes, had detonated like a bomb, scattering doubt, fear, and a dawning sense of undeniable truth. The judge had called for a brief recess to restore order. But as the jurors filed out, their eyes darted everywhere at the defendant, at the attorneys, at the door through which the little girl had exited with the police dog. They carried her words with them like an echo that refused to fade. Bad man. Those words lingered, staining every piece of evidence they had already heard. And now, when the jurors returned, they would not see that evidence the same way again. The prosecution's lead attorney, Caroline Hughes, sat rigid at her table, her pen forgotten in her hand. Her co-counsel leaned in. "Do you realize what just happened?" he whispered. Caroline nodded slowly. "Yes," she murmured. "But now we have to prove it. Because in the end, emotion wasn't enough. Juries might feel, but they also needed facts they could cling to, proof they could defend in the deliberation room. And Caroline knew the defense would do everything in its power to paint the child's words as unreliable, emotional, or manipulated. If the truth was to stick, she would have to tether it tightly to evidence. She shuffled through files, photographs, reports that had been presented already but never given proper weight. Pieces of the puzzle that had seemed disconnected suddenly had a shape when placed under the shadow of those two words. Her co-counsel pointed at a report. "Remember this?" It was a statement from a neighbor who had once heard muffled crying through the defendant's walls, dismissed at the time as inconclusive. The neighbor had said she thought it sounded like a child, but she hadn't been sure. Caroline's eyes narrowed. "A child's cry," she whispered. "And now we know whose cry it might have been." Another piece surfaced, a photograph of a broken toy, recovered from the defendant's property, thought to be irrelevant since it bore no fingerprints and couldn't be directly tied to the victim. But now, with the girl's testimony, its presence screamed louder. And then there were the drawings. Crude scribbles on notebook paper submitted by a child psychologist who had interviewed the girl months earlier. At the time, they had seemed too abstract to be meaningful. A stick figure with angry lines drawn around it, looming over a smaller one. The defense had dismissed them as nonsense. But now those drawings pulsed with meaning. The small figure scared. The large figure angry. The child had always been telling the truth, only now, finally, adults were listening. When the jury returned and the trial resumed, Caroline rose with renewed determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "you just heard the simplest testimony this courtroom may ever witness." A child with no reason to lie pointed to the man who hurt her. But let us not forget, we also have evidence that corroborates her courage. Evidence that until now seems scattered. Today, you will see how it all connects. The defense lawyer objected immediately. "Your Honor, the prosecution is attempting to build a case on the unreliable testimony of a toddler." The judge fixed him with a weary glare. "Counsel, she may argue her interpretation of the evidence." Overruled. Caroline wasted no time. She summoned the neighbor to the stand. The woman trembled as she told what she had heard late one night, muffled cries, small and fearful, coming from the defendant's home. "Did you report it?" Caroline asked. "I did," the woman replied, her voice steady. "But there wasn't enough proof back then. I was told children cry all the time, and it might be nothing. But after today," she faltered, her eyes glistening as she looked toward the jury. "After today, I know I wasn't imagining it." That was her voice I heard. The defense tried to poke holes, insisting it could have been anything: television, pets, even the neighbor's imagination. But the jurors' faces betrayed their skepticism. Doubt was no longer on the neighbor, it was on the defendant. Next came the photographs. Caroline held up the image of the broken toy. "This toy was found in the defendant's residence," she explained. At the time, it was dismissed as irrelevant. But when questioned earlier in the investigation, the child was asked if she recognized anything from the defendant's home. She pointed to this toy. She called it hers. The defense rose again, objecting furiously. "This is speculative at best," but Caroline cut him off, her voice sharp. Speculative? Or consistent? The child identified this toy. She whispered who the bad man was. And we found this object in his house. The jurors leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Finally, Caroline returned to the drawings. She projected them on the screen, one after another. "You may think these look like nothing more than the doodles of a toddler," she said. "But child psychologists will tell you otherwise. Children don't always communicate in words. They communicate in images, symbols, emotions. Look here." She pointed to the looming stick figure with scribbled red lines radiating from its head. She drew him angry. She drew herself small. And today, she spoke the words to match these pictures. The defense didn't rise this time. His objections had been silenced by the weight of connection. The courtroom grew still again, but it wasn't the fragile silence of before. It was a silence heavy with realization, the kind that makes the back of your neck prickle, the kind that bends even the most hardened skeptic toward belief. Every piece of evidence that once seemed weak on its own had been illuminated by the flashlight of the child's words. What once felt circumstantial now felt damning. Jurors exchanged looks, some with narrowed eyes, others with clenched jaws. They weren't just processing evidence anymore. They were picturing the nights the child had cried, the moments she had been small under the shadow of a bad man. And in that courtroom, their sympathy had fused with their sense of duty. The defendant sat rigid, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For the first time, his mask of confidence was gone. The walls were closing in, brick by brick, evidence by evidence, truth by truth. The chilling realization wasn't only for the jury or the public. It was for him, too. He had thought he could bury the truth under denials, loopholes, and intimidation. But the truth had survived in toys, in drawings, in muffled cries remembered by neighbors, and in the trembling courage of a 3-year-old child. And now, that truth was no longer buried. It was standing in full view of 12 jurors who would decide his fate. Caroline sat down, her chest rising and falling with the adrenaline of the moment. She knew the fight wasn't finished. The defense would still twist, still claw, still scream that this was coincidence and coaching. But she also knew something else. For the first time, the jury could see the full picture. And when people saw the full picture, they rarely looked away. The trial had entered its most extraordinary chapter, though not because of a lawyer's speech or a witness's revelation. No, the heartbeat of the courtroom, the unspoken force that had carried truth to the surface, was not a human being at all. It was a dog. He had no badge on his chest, no tie around his neck, no title other than support animal. Yet in those tense hours, he was as crucial as any piece of evidence, as any sworn oath. The German shepherd's name was Atlas. To most people in the room, he was simply a police dog trained, calm, obedient. But to the 3-year-old girl, he was more than that. He was safety wrapped in fur, courage she could touch, and a guardian who asked for nothing but trust. When the little girl had first entered the courtroom, her eyes wide and brimming with confusion, it wasn't the judge's warm instructions that eased her fear. It wasn't her advocate's gentle hand guiding her to the stand. It was Atlas, lying quietly at her feet, radiating calm. The dog had not moved when she whispered. He had not flinched when the defense attorney's voice rose, nor when the gallery erupted in shocked gasps. He had stayed utterly still, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, as if his very presence told her, "You are safe. I am here." And it worked. She had found her courage, not in the intimidating structure of the law, but in the unwavering loyalty of an animal who demanded nothing from her. That realization began to spread like wildfire through the courtroom. Journalists scribbled furiously, some pausing to look at Atlas with newfound respect. Jurors stole glances at him between notes, their eyes softening, as if they too felt reassured by his calm. Even the judge, who had once regarded therapy animals in court as an unusual novelty, found himself silently wondering if the entire system had underestimated the quiet power of such creatures. The prosecutor noticed too. Caroline Hughes sat back in her chair, reflecting. We would never have gotten those words without him. She remembered the early days of preparing for trial, when experts had urged her to allow the child access to a comfort animal. At first, she had hesitated. It seemed unorthodox, almost theatrical. Wouldn't it undermine the seriousness of the proceedings? Wouldn't the defense accuse her of trying to manipulate the jury emotionally? But now, watching Atlas stretched at the child's feet, she knew the truth. This was not manipulation. This was revelation. The dog had created a bridge no adult voice could have built. During recess, whispers filled the gallery. Reporters spoke quietly of other cases where dogs like Atlas had been used not to sniff out drugs or chase suspects, but to steady the hearts of children who had been forced into the terrifying spotlight of justice. One journalist, a woman with years of covering criminal trials, leaned to her colleague. I've seen hardened men confess under cross-examination. I've seen witnesses break down in tears, but I've never seen a moment like that. The dog made her brave. Her colleague nodded. And you could feel it. The whole room changed. Back in session, the defense attorney tried to minimize the dog's role, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So now we allow trained animals to influence witnesses? What's next, Your Honor, jury deliberations with comfort pets? The judge regarded him coolly. Counselor, you are free to cross-examine witnesses, not dogs. Leave the animal out of your arguments. A ripple of subdued laughter passed through the gallery. But beneath it, a more serious current flowed. People were beginning to realize that Atlas had done something the court could not yet unlock a child's voice without fear. Later, the child psychologist who had worked with the girl testified about the impact of therapy dogs. She explained, children who have endured trauma often struggle to speak in intimidating environments. Their trust in adults may be broken, but their trust in animals remains pure. A dog like Atlas provides non-judgmental companionship. He doesn't ask questions. He doesn't challenge their memory. He simply exists, steady and safe. That allows a child to express truths they might otherwise bury in silence. The jurors listened intently, nodding. One older juror wiped at her eyes as the psychologist continued. In my years of practice, I've seen children speak words to animals they would never speak to me, to their parents, or to the police. What you witnessed today was not coincidence. It was a bond, a silent language between child and dog that allowed her to say the truth. The defendant, however, sat stone-faced, glaring at the dog as if Atlas himself were a sworn enemy. His attorney scribbled notes furiously, but his frustration showed. No objection, no legal maneuver, could erase what the jury had seen with their own eyes. A trembling child whispering words of truth while her hand buried in a dog's fur. It was an image too powerful to dismiss. As the trial moved forward, Atlas remained a fixture in the courtroom, always by the child's side when she returned for follow-up questions. Each time, his calmness wrapped around her like invisible armor. She never had to face the man she feared alone. And the jury never forgot the sight. Every time they glanced toward her, they also saw him. The bond between them became part of the narrative, an unspoken testament to innocence and courage. Outside the courtroom, the story spread beyond the courthouse walls. News outlets ran headlines not only about the shocking words of the 3-year-old, but about the silent hero who had made it possible. Police dog helps child speak truth in court, one headline read. Another simply declared, Atlas, the brave. For once, amid the darkness of a case filled with fear and harm, there was light. The world found hope in the image of a child and a dog defeating silence with truth. But inside the courtroom, the stakes remained deadly serious. The defense would not relent, and the trial was far from over. Yet the balance had shifted irreversibly. Because the chilling truth had not just been revealed, it had been revealed through Atlas. And that mattered. It mattered because the jurors had seen a child empowered not by lawyers or judges, but by something pure, something undeniably real. The defense could argue coaching, manipulation, suggestion, but no one could argue the bond between child and dog. It was genuine. It was unbreakable. And it had become the beating heart of the case. Caroline Hughes, the prosecutor, sat back as Atlas lay quietly in the corner, the child stroking his fur as she waited to be excused. She thought of how strange justice could be, that sometimes it wasn't delivered by gavels or statutes, but by the steady breathing of a loyal animal who gave a child the strength to speak. The courtroom was a place of logic, rules, and evidence. But in that moment, everyone present knew justice was also about humanity. And sometimes, humanity spoke loudest through the silence of a dog. The day ended with the jury deep in thought, their notes cluttered not only with facts, but with impressions of fear, of courage, of loyalty. They had seen evidence, yes, but they had also seen something more profound, the human heart finding strength in the simplest companionship. And though the verdict was still days away, one truth had already become undeniable. The trial had not been won by words alone. It had been won by trust placed in a dog named Atlas, who had done what no human could. He had given a child her voice back. The courtroom had transformed into something unrecognizable. What began as a trial of evidence and procedure had morphed into a stage where law, emotion, and media spectacle collided. The two words whispered by a 3-year-old, the simple, devastating, bad man, had become the axis around which everything now turned. Outside the courthouse, reporters lined the sidewalks. Cameras pointed, microphones poised, capturing every movement of the child, the defendant, and even Atlas, the police dog who had become an unintentional star of the case. Every update was broadcast live. Every whispered rumor magnified. Social media erupted with hashtags, opinions, and debates. Some called the girl a hero. Others criticized the use of a child in court. The world watched, enthralled, and horrified. Inside, the jury sat like observers in a maelstrom. They had returned from lunch with expressions hardened by both awe and unease. Evidence alone no longer dominated their perception. Images, gestures, and the very presence of courage in a tiny human form carried immeasurable weight. The defense attorney knew they had lost control. He rose, his voice sharp and measured, attempting to regain a foothold in the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "I ask you to consider what is truly being presented here. A child, untrained in law, has uttered words that are being treated as proof. The media has sensationalized her appearance, creating pressure that no fair trial should withstand. We are in danger of letting emotion dictate justice." He gestured toward the child's absence. "Do not be swayed by the spectacle. Look instead at the facts. Look at inconsistencies. Examine timelines, witness reliability, and motive. Do not let innocence be exploited to overshadow reason." Some jurors nodded, their pens moving feverishly across notebooks, as if to reaffirm their grasp on logic. But beneath the careful scrutiny, unease lingered. They remembered her small fingers pointing. They remembered her whisper, heard and recorded. They remembered Atlas, calm and protective, giving her courage where no adult could. The defense attempted another tactic, character witnesses. People who had known the defendant described him as kind, reliable, ordinary. They spoke of his volunteering at community events, his polite interactions, his adherence to rules. Their testimony was meant to humanize him, to create doubt that the jurors might cling to. But it was a delicate illusion. Each account felt strangely distant, unable to contend with the vividness of the child's presence earlier in the trial. The jurors could see that kindness in abstract, but they could feel fear and courage in the child, the tactile, undeniable reality. The prosecution rose again, her strategy now more surgical than emotional. Caroline Hughes addressed the jury with precision. "We are not asking you to abandon reason," she said. "We are asking you to consider all the evidence, including the parts you saw for yourself. A child cannot fabricate fear. A dog cannot fabricate courage. The two together revealed a truth this court can no longer ignore." She laid out the timeline again, connecting evidence to her argument, the neighbor's recollection of muffled cries, the broken toy discovered at the defendant's home, the child's drawings, and most importantly, the words spoken with trembling clarity. Each piece aligned under a new lens, the lens created by a child's simple declaration of fear. Every juror's pen scratched, but now their notes were heavier, more deliberate. They could sense the weight of the evidence shifting. The defense had tried to isolate facts, separate testimony, and remove emotion, but the two were inseparable. Outside the courtroom, media coverage had exploded. Live feeds showed the gallery as emptying and filling, the little girl escorted safely in and out, and Atlas lying quietly at her side. Hashtags like #Justice for the Child and #Atlas, the hero, trended nationally. Opinion columns debated ethics and methodology, some praising the innovative use of therapy animals, others criticizing what they called emotional manipulation. Within the courtroom, the defense became visibly flustered. They attempted to argue coaching, suggesting the child had been influenced by the police dog or the prosecutors. They questioned the methodology of the child psychologist, citing technicalities in her reports. But each objection, each attempt to discredit, seemed to weaken under scrutiny. The jurors were no longer just processing words, they were processing authenticity. They had witnessed fear, courage, and instinct in a child who had no reason to lie. And even the sharpest legal argument could not erase that visceral memory. The defendant's demeanor began to crack. He shifted constantly in his chair, fists clenched, jaw tight. His face betrayed his frustration with every gesture, every twitch. The mask of calm he had worn for weeks was slipping, revealing a tension that could not be fabricated. The jury noticed. Even jurors trained in detachment felt a shift in perception. Human intuition, long suppressed by rules and instructions, rose to the surface. They saw fear, deceit, and guilt in ways evidence alone could not measure. Meanwhile, the child had been safely escorted out once again, allowing the lawyers to proceed without her direct presence. Yet her earlier testimony, her whispered words, and the image of Atlas remained lodged in everyone's memory. It had become a lens through which the rest of the trial was now interpreted. In this charged environment, Caroline Hughes knew that her next move was crucial. She called her final witnesses, forensic analysts who connected physical evidence to the child's observations. Broken locks, fingerprints, and fibers, all previously viewed as minor details, suddenly coalesced into a pattern consistent with the child's testimony. It was a meticulous unveiling of truth, crafted not with volume or drama, but with patience and precision. Every juror leaned forward, noting connections they might have overlooked before. Even the defense attorney, seated with his head resting on his hand, could not mask the growing unease that the cumulative weight of these facts carried. The courtroom became more than a venue for legal argument. It had become a microcosm of modern trials themselves. Emotion, media, and instinct intertwined with law, creating a complex ecosystem in which truth emerged not only through facts, but through perception. A child's fear, a dog's steadfast presence, and meticulous evidence converged to reveal a reality that neither side could fully control. The defense attempted a last desperate plea, calling on procedural technicalities, questioning the validity of every testimony, and appealing to the jurors' sense of traditional detachment. But the tide had turned. The modern trial had its own rules, beyond the confines of statute and precedent. The jury's consciousness had been altered by what they had seen, innocence and courage in its most elemental form. As the day drew to a close, the courtroom felt charged with unspoken tension. Every person present understood that the trial had entered a final phase, one where truth and perception were inseparable. The defendant, now visibly shaken, could only stare at the empty spot where the child had sat, knowing her words had irrevocably changed the course of his life. Atlas lay quietly in the corner, oblivious to the chaos around him, yet fully aware of his impact. In a world driven by logic and law, he had provided a conduit for human instinct, the bridge that allowed a child's voice to be heard, a truth to be felt, and justice to find a foothold in the hearts of those who would decide the final outcome. When the jury finally left for the day, their expressions were solemn, thoughtful, and unshakably aware of the extraordinary circumstances they had witnessed. Trials of modern times were no longer merely about statutes and evidence. They were about perception, courage, and the enduring power of human or canine compassion. And though the verdict was still to come, one truth was clear to everyone in that room. The courtroom would never forget the day when a 3-year-old, with the help of a loyal dog, had revealed a chilling truth that no law, no argument, and no strategy could suppress. The courtroom was silent, charged with anticipation. Every person present seemed to hold their breath as the jury filed in, faces composed but eyes heavy with the burden of decision. For weeks they had wrestled with testimony, evidence, and argument. But underlying it all was something far more elemental, the memory of a child, her trembling voice, and the steady presence of a dog who had helped her speak the truth. The judge cleared his throat and called the room to order. The final moments of the trial had arrived. The foreperson of the jury rose, a woman in her 50s with a calm but resolute demeanor. She held the verdict in her hands, the folded paper that would decide the fate of the man who had inspired both fear and disbelief throughout the proceedings. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady despite the tension, "we, the jury, have reached a verdict." All eyes turned toward the defendant. He sat rigid, jaw tight, hands clenched on the edge of the table. His defense attorney whispered hurriedly, trying to maintain composure, but the air around them was thick with inevitability. The juror continued, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "On the charge of assault and endangerment of a minor, we find the defendant guilty." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Some whispered, some cried, some nodded grimly. The child's advocate exhaled, relief evident in her trembling shoulders. Caroline Hughes, the prosecutor, sat back with a mixture of triumph and profound respect for the courage displayed by the youngest witness in the room. The defendant slumped in his seat, a man once confident, now stripped bare by the revelation of truth. His attorney muttered protests, but they were drowned out by the weight of the verdict itself. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. The court acknowledges the jury's verdict. The defendant is guilty as charged. Silence fell, deeper and more solemn than the cheers or gasps from the gallery. Justice had been served, not by force or spectacle alone, but through courage, truth, and the extraordinary bond between a child and a dog. In the days that followed, the courtroom became a symbol beyond the city limits. News outlets broadcast footage of the trial, focusing on the 3-year-old who had spoken 2 words that revealed a chilling truth, and the German shepherd who had made it possible. Headlines like "Child's Whisper Brings Justice" and "Atlas, a dog who helped save a life," spread across the nation. Interviews explored the extraordinary method of using therapy dogs in court, emphasizing the importance of providing safe environments for child witnesses. Psychologists praised the innovative approach, highlighting how nonverbal support could help traumatized children articulate truths they might otherwise conceal. Yet amidst the media frenzy, one fact remained clear. The power of Atlas and the courage of the child had transcended conventional legal strategy. They had reminded the world that justice is not only about statutes and procedure, it is about empathy, instinct, and the human or canine ability to bring hidden truths to light. The child returned home to a quiet, safe environment. Her parents, still shaken by the trial, wrapped her in warmth and reassurance. The rabbit she had clutched throughout the proceedings remained in her arms, worn and comforting, but Atlas continued to be a presence in her life, visiting during supervised sessions arranged by the court. Though the child was too young to fully comprehend the gravity of what had happened, she had internalized the key lesson, that fear could be met with courage, and that support, whether human or animal, could empower her voice. Caroline Hughes visited the family quietly one afternoon. "You were incredibly brave," she said softly. "What you did helped more people than you realize." The girl looked up at her, eyes wide, then at Atlas, who nuzzled her shoulder. She simply smiled, a small, pure expression of triumph that needed no words. The defendant faced sentencing weeks later. The evidence, strengthened by the child's testimony, drawings, the broken toy, and neighbor accounts, left no room for doubt. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, ensuring that the danger he posed would be removed from the community. During the sentencing hearing, the child did not appear, nor did Atlas, yet the courtroom remembered them. Every word of the judge's pronouncement seemed to echo with the silent, unwavering courage displayed during the trial. Even those who had doubted the process felt the weight of what had occurred, the undeniable truth revealed by innocence, supported by trust and loyalty. In the legal community, the trial became a case study. Law schools dissected the proceedings, discussing the integration of therapy animals in sensitive cases. Psychologists and child advocates cited it as an example of how trauma-informed approaches could alter the course of justice. But for the general public, the story remained simple and powerful. A child's courage, a dog's steadfast presence, and two words that changed everything. It was a reminder that truth often resides in the smallest, quietest voices, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are those who speak without words, yet convey the weight of entire lives. Years later, the child grew up with the memory of that day etched into her consciousness. She would sometimes revisit the photographs and news stories of the trial, but she remembered most vividly the quiet calm of Atlas beside her, the gentle support that gave her the strength to say what no one else could. For the city and its residents, the trial remained a touchstone. Community programs were established to train therapy dogs for court use. Workshops were held for law enforcement and child advocates on trauma-sensitive procedures. The case reshaped protocols nationwide, demonstrating how the intersection of compassion and procedure could protect vulnerable witnesses and reveal hidden truths. The legacy of the trial endured not merely in legal reforms, but in the lives it touched. For one young girl, it was a lesson in bravery. For a dog, it was proof of his silent power to protect and inspire. For the world, it was a reminder that sometimes justice comes in the smallest packages, with the quietest whispers, and through the loyalty of an unlikely hero. In the end, it was simple. A child had been scared, a dog had been steady, and together they had exposed the truth. Two words, soft, trembling, almost invisible, had changed the course of a trial, altered the life of a man who had sought to harm, and inspired a community to reconsider what courage and justice truly meant. And though the courtroom emptied, the echo remained, a resonant truth that would endure far beyond the gavel, Fear can be met with courage, and truth, no matter how small, will always find a way to be heard.